So let's introduce first our pro team arguing for tonight's motion. Be it resolved, what you call political correctness, I call progress. Please welcome to the stage. He's an award-winning writer, scholar, broadcaster on NPR and sports networks across America, Michael Eric Dyson. Michael, come on out.
Thank you, Michael.
Stephen's teammate is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, a YouTube sensation, and the author of the big new international bestseller, 12 Rules for Life. Ladies and gentlemen, Toronto's Jordan Peterson. Okay, Peterson to speak for the con team.
Hello. So we should first decide what we're talking about. We're not talking about my views of political correctness, despite what you might have inferred from the last speaker's comments. This is how it looks to me. We essentially need something approximating a low-resolution grand narrative to unite us. And we need a narrative to unite us because otherwise we don't have peace. What's playing out in the universities and in broader society right now is a debate between two fundamental low-resolution narratives, neither of which can be completely accurate because they can't encompass all the details. Obviously, human beings have an individual element and a collective element, a group element, let's say. The question is, what story should be paramount? And this is how it looks to me. In the West, we have reasonably functional, reasonably free, remarkably productive, stable hierarchies that are open to consideration of the dispossessed that hierarchies generally create. Our societies are freer and functioning more effectively than any societies anywhere else in the world and than any societies ever have. And as far as I'm concerned, and I think there's good reason to assume this, it's because the fundamental low-resolution grand narrative that we've oriented ourselves around in the West is one of the sovereignty of the individual, and it's predicated on the idea that all things considered, the best way for me to interact with someone else is individual to individual, and to react to that person as if they're both part of the process, because that's the right way of thinking about it, the psychological process by which things we don't understand can yet be explored, and by things that aren't properly organized in our society can be yet set right. And the reason we're valuable as individuals, both with regards to our rights and responsibilities, is because that's our essential purpose, and that's our nobility, and that's our function. What's happening, as far as I'm concerned, in the universities in particular, and spreading very rapidly out into the broader world, including the corporate world, much to what should be its chagrin, is a collectivist narrative. And of course, there's some utility in a collectivist narrative because we're all part of groups in different ways. But the collectivist narrative that I regard as politically correct is a strange pastiche of postmodernism and neomarxism. And its fundamental claim is that no, you're not essentially an individual. You're essentially a member of a group. And that group might be your ethnicity, and it might be your sex, and it might be your race. It might be any of the endless numbers of other potential groups that you belong to because you belong to many of them. And that you should be essentially categorized along with those who are like you on that dimension in that group. That's proposition number one. Proposition number two is that the proper way to view the world is as a battleground between groups of different power. So you define the groups first, and then you assume that you view the individual from the group context, you view the battle between groups from the group context, and you view history itself as a consequence of nothing but the power maneuvers between different groups. That eliminates any consideration of the individual at a very fundamental level, and also any idea, for example, of free speech, because if you're collectivist at heart in this manner, there is no such thing as free speech. It isn't that it's debated by those on the radical left, and let's say the rest of us, so to speak. It's that in that formulation, there's no such thing as free speech, because for an individualist, free speech is how you make sense of the world and reorganize society in a proper manner. But for the radical left-type collectivist that's associated with this viewpoint of political correctness, when you speak, all you're doing is playing a power game on behalf of your group. And there's nothing else that you can do, because that's all there is. And not only is that all there is in terms of who you are as an individual now and how society should be viewed, it's also the fundamental narrative of history. For example, it's widely assumed in our universities now that the best way to conceptualize Western civilization is as an oppressive, male-dominated patriarchy, and that the best way to construe relationships between men and women across the centuries is one of oppression of women by men. It's like, well, look, no hierarchy is without its tyranny. That's an axiomatic truth. People have recognized that literally for thousands of years. And hierarchies do tend towards tyranny, and they tend towards the usurpation by people with power. But that only happens when they become corrupt. We have mechanisms in our society to stop hierarchies from becoming intolerably corrupt, and they actually work pretty well. And so I would also point this out. You know, don't be thinking that this is a debate about whether empathy is useful or not, or that the people on the con side of the argument are not empathetic. I know perfectly well, as I'm sure Mr. Fry does, that hierarchies tend to produce situations where people stack up at the bottom, and that the dispossessed in hierarchies need a political voice, which is the proper voice of the left, by the way, and the necessary voice of the left. But that is not the same as proclaiming that the right level of analysis for our grand unifying narrative is that all of us are fundamentally to be identified by the groups that we belong to and to construe the entire world as the battleground between different forms of tyranny in consequence of that group affiliation. And to the degree that we play out that narrative, that won't be progress, believe me, and we certainly haven't seen that progress in the universities. We've seen situations like what happened at Wilfrid Laurier University instead. We won't see progress. What we'll return to is exactly the same kind of tribalism that characterized the left.
Jordan, we're going to have 3 minutes up on the screen there. Please respond to what you've heard.
Well, I guess I would like to set out a challenge in somewhat the same format as Mr. Fry did to people on the moderate left. I mean, I've studied totalitarianism for a very long time, both on the left and on the right in various forms. And I think we've done a pretty decent job of determining when right-wing beliefs become dangerous. I think that they become dangerous when the people who stand on the right evoke notions of racial superiority or ethnic superiority, something like that. It's fairly easy to draw a box around them and place them to one side and necessary, and I think we've done a pretty good job of that. What I fail to see happening on the left, and this is with regards to the sensible left, because such a thing exists, is for the same thing to happen with regards to the radical leftists. Okay, so here's an open question. If it's not diversity, inclusivity, and equity as a triumvirate that mark out the two excessive left, and with equity defined, by the way, not as equality of opportunity, which is an absolutely laudable goal, but as equality of outcome, which is how it's defined, then exactly how do we demarcate the two extreme left? What do? We say, well, there's no such thing as the two extreme left? Well, that's certainly something that characterized much of intellectual thinking for the 20th century, as our high-order intellectuals, especially in places like France, did everything they could to bend over backwards to ignore absolutely everything that was happening in the catastrophic left world, in the Soviet Union and in Maoist China, not least. We've done a terrible job of determining how to demarcate what's useful from the left from what's pathological. And so it's perfectly okay for someone to criticize my attempts to identify something like a boundary. We could say diversity, inclusivity, and equity, especially equity, which is in fact equality of outcome, which is an absolutely abhorrent notion. If you know anything about history, you know that. And I'm perfectly willing to hear some reasonable alternatives, but what I hear continually from people on the left, first of all, as my opponents did, to construe every argument that is possibly able to be construed on the axis of group identification, and to fail to help the rest of us differentiate the reasonable left, which stands for the oppressed, necessarily, from the pathological left that's capable of unbelievable destruction. And what I see happening in the university campuses in particular, where the leftists absolutely predominate, and that's certainly not my imagination, that's well documented by perfectly reasonable people like Jonathan Haidt, is an absolute failure to make precisely that distinction. And I see the same thing echoed tonight. Thank you.
I feel freer already. I don't know what mythological collective Mr. Peterson refers to. I'm part of the left. They're cantankerous. When they have a firing squad, it's usually in a semicircle. Part of the skepticism of rationality was predicated upon the Enlightenment Project, which says we're no longer going to be subordinate to skepticism, to superstition. We're going to think, and we're going to think well. Thomas Jefferson was one of the great arbiters of rationality, but he was also a man who was a slave owner. How do you reconcile that? That's the complication I'm speaking about. That's not either or. That's not a collective identity. Thomas Jefferson believed in the collective identity. That is during the day. At night, he got some Luther Vandross songs, went out to the slave quarter, and engaged in sexual relations and had many children with Sally Hemings. His loins trumped his logic. And when he talks about postmodernism, I don't know who he's talking about. I teach postmodernism. It's kind of fun. Jacques Derrida, just to say his name is beautiful. Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault talked about the insurrection of subjugated knowledges, people who had been marginalized now beginning to speak. The subaltern, as Gayatri Spivak talks about it in postcolonial theory. The reason these people grew up and grew into existence and had a voice is because they were denied. As Ms. Goldberg said, our group identity was foisted upon us. We weren't seen as individuals. Babe Ruth, when he broke the home run record, he didn't bat against all best ball players. He batted against the best white ball players. When it's been rigged in your favor from the very beginning, it's hard for you to understand how much you've been rigged. You're born on third base and then you hit a triple at the Toronto Blue Jays game. And here we are deriving our sense of identity from the very culture that we ignore. Look at the indigenous names and the First Nation names. Toronto, Saskatchewan, Winnipeg, Tim Hortons. But I'll tell you, there's an envy of the kind of freedom and liberty that people of color and other minorities bring because we bring the depth of knowledge in our body. There's a kind of jealousy of that. As the greatest living Canadian philosopher, Aubrey Drake Graham says, jealousy is just love and hate at the same time. And so for me, I think it's necessary. I agree with Mr. Fry. We shouldn't be nasty and combative. And yet, I don't see nastiness and combativeness from people. I see them making a desire to have their individual identities respected. When I get shot down for no other reason than I'm black, when I get categorized for no other reason than my color, I am living in a culture that refuses to see me as a great individual.
So, Michael, to start with you, why isn't there just harm that's done to groups by privileging their group identity, whether it be a group identity of race or of gender, and not immediately treating them as individuals in the way that Jordan and Stephen would like to see them first?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, there was no arbitrary and random distinction that people of color and other minority groups made. When I talked about the invention of race, the invention of gender, the invention of groupthink, that was not done by those groups that have been so named, as Ms. Goldberg said. So first of all, you've got to acknowledge the historical evolution of that reality, and the concept of group identity did not begin with them. It began with a group that didn't have to announce its identity. When you are in control, you don't have to announce who you are. So that many white brothers and sisters don't see themselves as one among many other ethnicities or groups, but they see themselves as, I'm just American, I'm Canadian, can't you be like us? Can't you transcend those narrow group identifications? And yet, those group identifications have been imprinted upon them by the very people who now, because their group power has been challenged, let's make no mistake about it, there's a challenge. I agree with Mr. Fry in a kind of Netherland of how sweet it would be to have a kingly and queenly metaphor about how it got resolved. That ain't the real deal, homie. And in the real world, in the real world, there's stuff at stake. What's at stake are bodies. What's at stake are people's lives. What's at stake? People are still being lynched, killed. What's at stake? People because of their sexuality and their racial identity are still being harmed. So I'm suggesting to you it's not that we are against being treated as individuals. That's what we're crying for. Please don't see me as a member of a group that you think is a thug, a nigger, a nihilist, a pathological person. See me as an individual who embodies the realities of who I am. But I'll end by saying this. What Michelle said is extremely important. The people who have individual rights did not have to fight for them in the same manner that people of color and others have had to. When Mr. Fry talked about enslavement, he named them. Read Orlando Patterson's comparative history of race and slavery over 28 civilizations. The Greeks did not have the same kind of slavery that Americans did. It was chattel slavery. In Greece, you could buy back your freedom. You could teach the children of the people who enslaved you, and because of your display of prodigious intellect, you could secure your freedom. That was not the case. You were punished and killed for literacy in America. So my point simply is this, is that I am all for the celebration of broader identities. And I think that often those who are minorities and others are not celebrated for the degree that we are. I'll end by saying this. In America, we have the Confederate flag. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that. We have a Confederate flag. We have white guys, mostly, in the South, but others as well, flying those Confederate flags that are part of the South that refuse to cede its legitimate conquest at the hands of the North. There has been a politics of resentment. You talk about politics of identity, wearing that flag, not the American flag. They are not American. They are celebrating a secession, a move away from America. And a man named Colin Kaepernick, who is a football player, saying, I want to bring beauty to that flag, has been denied opportunity. So we have to really set the terms of debate in order before we proceed.
Thank you, man. Good point. Jordan, let's have you jump in on this idea of what you see as the pernicious danger of groupthink when it comes to ethnicity, when it comes to gender. Why do you think that's one of the primal sins, in your view, of political correctness?
Well, I think it's one of the primal sins of identity politics players on the left and the right, just to be clear about that. Personally, since this has got personal at times, I'm no fan of the identitarian right. I think that anybody who plays a game, a conceptual game, where group identity comes first and foremost, risks an exacerbation of tribalism. It doesn't matter whether it's on the left or the right. With regards to the idea of group rights, well, there's a fundamental, and this is something we've fallen into terribly in Canada, not least because we had to contend with the threat of Quebec separatism, but the idea of group rights is extraordinarily problematic because the obverse of the coin of individual rights is individual responsibilities. And you can hold an individual responsible, and an individual can be responsible. And so that's partly why individuals have rights. But groups, how do you hold a group responsible? I mean, the whole idea is it's not a good idea to hold a group responsible. First of all, it flies in the face of the idea of the sort of justice systems that we've laid out in the West that are essentially predicated first on the assumption of individual innocence, but also on the possibility of individual guilt, not group guilt. We saw what happened in the 20th century many, many times when the idea of group guilt was enabled to get a foothold, let's say, in the polity and in the justice system. It was absolutely catastrophic. And so, okay, fine, group rights. Well, how are you going to contend with the alternative to that, the opposite of that? Where's the group responsibility? And how are you going to hold your groups responsible? Well, we don't have to talk about that because we're too concerned with rectifying historical injustices, hypothetical and otherwise. And that's certainly not to say that there weren't any shortage of absolutely catastrophic historical injustices. That's not the point. The point is how you view the situation at the most fundamental level. And group rights are an absolute catastrophe, in my opinion.
Be empirical. Now, empirical, as far as I know, where it means that which can be verified or falsified through the census.
Exactly.
So if we look at it in an objective way, the reality is that people don't have equal access to the means to articulate the very moment you're talking about.
I'm talking about the empirical results of this political attitude.
I understand that, but my point is simply this. I'm suggesting to you that people use the weapons at hand. Now, it was Abraham Joshua Heschel, the rabbi, who said everybody's not guilty, but everybody's responsible. Right? That's the distinction there. Everybody clearly is not guilty. But what's interesting, look at the flip side. If you have benefited from 300 years of holding people in servitude, thinking that you did it all on your own, why can't these people work harder? Let me see, for 300 years, you ain't had no job. So the reality is, for 300 years, you hold people in the bands. You hold them in subordination. You refuse to give them rights. Then all of a sudden, you free them and say you're now individuals. Not having the skills, not having the skills. I'm talking about America, first of all. I'm talking about American society, first of all. I'm talking about the Northern Hemisphere. I'm talking about every society where enslavement has existed, but I'm speaking specifically of the repudiation of individual rights among people of color in America who were denied the opportunity to be individuals. So I obviously, and ideally, and I think Michelle Goldberg does too, agree with the emphasis on individuals. What we're saying to you is that we have not been permitted to be individuals. We have not been permitted to exercise our individual autonomy and authority, and the refusal to do so, to recognize me as an individual, means when you roll up on me and I'm a 12-year-old boy in a park and you shoot first in ways you do to black kids that you don't do to white kids, you are not treating that person as an individual. If we're living in a society where women are subject to aberrant forms of horrid, patriarchal, sexist, and misogynist behavior, you are not acknowledging the centrality of the individuality of women. You are treating them according to a group dynamic. And if we get beyond the ability of people on the right to understand the degree to which they have operated from the basis of benefit from group identity without having said, I'll end by saying this, the great American philosopher Beyonce Knowles said that it has been said that racism is so American that if you challenge racism, you look like you're challenging America. We are challenging inequality. We are challenging the refusal to see me as an individual. When we overcome that, have at it, we're all on equal
So,
plane.
I think it's good.
The body's getting stirred here.
So I've got a couple of questions.
So let's your side spoke to. I'm going to get Jordan, then to you.
Let's
Sean.
assume for a moment that I've benefited from my white privilege. Okay, so let's assume that.
That's
That's
an
fine.
assumption. That's
Yeah,
an
well, that's what you would say. So, so let's say, here, let's get precise about this, okay?
Was that very individual of you?
Let's get precise about this, okay?
Let's get precise.
To what degree is my present level of attainment or achievement a consequence of my white privilege? And I don't mean sort of. I mean, do you mean 5%? Do you mean 15%? Do you mean 25%? Do you mean 75%? And what do you propose I do about it? How about a tax? How about a tax that's like specialized for me so that I can account for my damn privilege,
You're
so that I
talking
can
great
stop
shit right
hearing
now.
about it? Now, let's get precise about one other thing, okay? We'll get precise about one other thing. Now,
Precise?
yeah, precise, yes. And so, if we can agree, and we haven't, that the left can go too far, which it clearly can, then how would my worthy opponents precisely define when the left that they stand for has gone too far? You didn't like equity, equality of outcome. I think that's a great marker. But if you have a better suggestion and won't sidestep the question, so let's figure out how I can dispense with my white privilege, and so that you can tell me when the left has gone too far, since they clearly can. And that's what this debate is about political correctness. It's about the left going too far. And I think it's gone too far in many ways. And I'd like to figure out exactly how and when, so the reasonable left could make its ascendance again, and we could quit all this nonsense.
Okay,
The very problem, except terminologically. You're beginning at a point that's already productive and controversial. You're saying, how can he get his equality back? Who are you talking about? Jordan Peterson, trending #1 on Twitter? Jordan Peterson,
Most
with an
best
international bestseller? I want him to tweet something out about me in my book. Jordan Peterson, right? This is what I'm saying to you. Why the rage, bruh? You're doing well, but you're a mean, mad white man, and you're going to cut us right. And I have never seen so much wine and snowflaking. There's enough wine in here to start a vineyard. And what I'm saying to you empirically and precisely, when you ask the question about white privilege, the fact that you ask it in the way you did, dismissive, pseudoscientific, non-empirical, and without justification, the truth is that white privilege doesn't act according to quantifiable segments. It's about the degree to which we are willing as a society to grapple with the ideals of freedom, justice, and equality upon which it's based. Number two, what's interesting to me, you're talking about not having a collective identity. What do you call a nation? Are you Canadian? Are you Canadian by yourself? Are you an individual, or are you part of a group? When America formed its union, it did so in opposition to another group. So the reality is that those who are part of group identities in politics deny the legitimacy and validity of those groups and the fact that they have been created thusly, and then have resentment against others. All I'm asking for is the opportunity. The quotation you talk about, the difference between equality of outcome and equality of opportunity, that's a staid and retried argument, hackneyed phrase, derived from the halcyon days of the debate over affirmative action. Are you looking for outcomes that can be determined equally, or are you looking for opportunity? If you free a person after a whole long time of oppression and say now you are free to survive, if you have no skills, if you have no quantifiable means of existence, what you have done is liberated them into oppression. And all I'm suggesting to you, Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of our great presidents, said, if you start a man in a race 100 years behind, it is awfully difficult to catch up. So I don't think Jordan Peterson is suffering from anything except an exaggerated sense of entitlement and resentment, and his own privilege is invisible to him, and it's manifest with lethal intensity and ferocity right here on stage.
Jordan, I'm going to have to let you respond to that if you like.
Well, what I derive from that series of rebuttals, let's say, is twofold. The first is that saying that the radical left goes too far when they engage in violence is not a sufficient response by any stretch of the imagination, because there are sets of ideas in radical leftist thinking that led to the catastrophes of the 20th century, and that was at the level of idea, not at the level of violent action. It's a very straightforward thing to say you're against violence. It's like being against poverty. It's like, you know, generically speaking, decent people are against poverty and violence. It doesn't address the issue in the least. And with regards to my privilege or lack thereof, I mean, I'm not making the case that I haven't had advantages in my life and disadvantages in my life like most people. You don't know anything about my background or where I came from. It doesn't matter to you because fundamentally I'm a mean white man. That's a hell of a thing to say in a debate.
Let me just say,
Very, very brief, because I want to move on to men and women.
the mean mad white comment was not predicated upon my historical excavation of your past. It's based upon the evident vitriol with which you speak and the denial of a sense of equanimity among combatants in an argument. So I'm saying again, you're a mean mad white man, and the viciousness is evident.
Okay. Let's reset. Change the deck here. Let's talk about this, because you've written and commented about a lot. Stephen, thank you for that.
Well, I think I'm going to point out two things again. The first is that my question about when the left goes too far still hasn't been answered. And then the second thing I'm going to point out is that, you know, it's conceivable that I am a mean man. You know, I mean, maybe I'm meaner than some people and not as mean as others. I think that's probably more the case. But I would say the fact that race got dragged into that particular comment is a better exemplar of what the hell I think is wrong with the politically correct left than anything else that could have possibly happened.
Imagine the hurt the anxiety, the insult that you might genuinely feel, according to what I felt was an appropriate comment of description at the moment of its expression. But imagine now those hurt feelings, and
Not hurt.
okay, you feel great. You feel great about it.
That's really different. I'm not a
Right?
victim. I'm not hurt. I'm
You're
appalled.
not hurt. Okay, you wouldn't be a victim. So what's interesting is that whatever non-traditional feelings of empathy you endure at this particular point, the point is, imagine then the horrors that so many others have had to put up with for so long when they are refused to acknowledge their humanity. Now, I take your point seriously.
So your
Let me finish. Let me finish.
to me.
Let me finish.
That
You're
figures.
not my inquisitioner. Okay. What I'm saying to you is that when you said you were upset that I added the element of race there, right? When I said mean, mad, white man. Well, what's interesting is that you may have felt that you were being ascribed a group identity to which you do not subscribe. You may have felt that you were being unfairly judged according to your particular race. You may have felt that your individual identity was being besmirched by my rather careless characterization of you, all of which qualifies for a legitimate response to me, but also the point we've been trying to make about the refusal to see our individual existence as women, as people of color, as First Nation people, and the like. My point simply has been, the reason I talked about race in that particular characterization, because there's a particular way in which I have come to a city. I don't know if there are a lot of black people out here. Not sure. But I constantly come to places and spaces that are not my natural habitat, other than intellectual engagement and the love and the fury of rhetorical engagement, yes. But I often go into hostile spaces where people will not vote in favor for my particular viewpoint because I'm interested as an individual of breaking down barriers so that people can understand just how complicated it is. So what I'm saying to you is that I would invite you, in terms of the surrender of your privilege, to give you a specific response. Come with me to a Black Baptist church. Come with me to a historically black college. Come to me to an indigenous or First Nations community where we're able to engage in some of the lovely conversation, but also to listen and hear. And when I added race to that, I was talking about the historically evinced inability to acknowledge others' pains equally to the one that they are presently enduring. So, as a human being, I love you, my brother, but I stand by my comment.
Well, I've seen the sorts of things that you're talking about. I happen to be an honorary member of an indigenous family, so don't tell me about what I should go see with regards to oppression. You don't know anything about me.
You asked me a question, I gave you a response.
Yeah. You gave me a generic response, a
It's not
generic
generic.
race-based
It's
response.
Jordan Peterson, I would like for you to come with me, Michael Eric Dyson, to a Black Baptist church. You been to one of those?
I would be happy to do that. By
Okay, all right, I'm gonna hook you up.
Okay, good. We'll make sure that happens.
Paul, I'd like you to contend with the set of left-wing ideas that produced all the left-wing pathologies of the 20th century and to define how you think standard left-wing thinking, which has a valuable
Again,
place,
so we're-
goes too far, since it obviously
Has
does.
the right gone too far? Has the right gone too far?
Of course the right
How?
has gone
Tell
too
us
far.
how.
Well, how about Auschwitz?
I mean,
Well, I was talking about 20th century
right.
politics.
What else? More recently, what has gone wrong with the right?
Look, I don't like identity politics players at all. I don't care whether they're on the left or the right. I've been lecturing about right-wing extremism for 30 years. I'm no fan of the right, despite the fact that the left would like to paint me that way because it's more
How
convenient
has the
for
right
them.
gone too far recently?
Well, where? It's threatening to go too far in identitarian Europe, that's for sure. It's gone too far in Charlottesville. It went too far in Norway. Like, how long a list do you want? And why am I required to produce that? To show you that I don't like the identitarian
us,
right?
that's what I'd ask you.
I was actually asking you a question. So your assumption is somehow that I must be on the side of the right. It's like, look, the
I
right
didn't say
hasn't occupied the humanities and the social sciences. It's as simple as that for me. If they had, I'd be objecting to them.
Say that again, I didn't hear.
The right has not occupied the social sciences and the humanities. And the left clearly has. The statistical evidence for that is overwhelming.
Sir, what about IQ testing in terms of genetic inheritance?
Sorry, we're here to talk about political correctness, and we've done a damn poor job
Oh,
of it.
I see. I gave you an example.
Okay,
now you can't answer it.
let's all
Okay,
then
right.
redeem ourselves with our closing statements. Michael, we're going to put 3 minutes on the clock for you. Please, your closing.
Thank you so much for that compliment, Brother Fry. I'm used to, not exclusively white men, who see black intelligence articulated at a certain level, feeling a kind of condescension. If I came up here, Mr. I was saying the other day, but a kind of verbal facility automatically assumed to be a kind of hucksterism and snake oil salesman. I've seen that. I get it. I get hate letters every day from white brothers and sisters who are mad I'm teaching their children. You're just trying to co-opt our children. You're trying to corrupt them. Yes, I'm trying to corrupt them so they will be uncorrupted by the corruptibility that they've inherited from a society that refuses to see all people as human beings. The death threats I've received constantly for simply trying to speak my mind, it's not about a politically correct society that is open-minded and that has some consternation about my ability to speak. I'm getting real live. You want empirical death threats that talk about killing me, setting up to hurt me and harm me, simply because I choose to speak my mind. I agree with my confreres and my compatriots that we should argue against the vicious limitation and recursions against speech. I believe that everybody has the right to be able to articulate themselves, and the enormous privilege we have to come to a spot in a space like this means that we have that privilege and we should be responsible for it. No matter where we go from here, me and Brother Peterson will go to a Black Baptist church. I'm gonna hold him to that. He said it on national TV. We're gonna go to a Black Baptist church and have an enlightening conversation about the need for us to engage in not only reciprocal and mutual edification, but criticism, even hard and tough criticism, but in a way that speaks to the needs and interests of those who don't usually get on TV, whose voices are not usually amplified, whose ideas are not usually taken seriously. And when they get to the upper echelons of the ability of a society to express themselves, they are equally subject to vicious recrimination and hurtful resistance. There's an old story about the pig and the pig and the chicken going down the street and saying, let's have breakfast. The chicken just has to give up an egg. The pig has to give up his ass in order to make breakfast. We have often been the pigs giving up our asses to make breakfast. Let's start sharing them asses with everybody else. Thank you.
So I'm not here to claim that there's no such thing as oppression, unfairness, brutality, discrimination, unfair use of power, all of those. Anyone with any sense knows that hierarchical structures tilt towards tyranny, and that we have to be constantly wakeful to ensure that all they are isn't power and tyranny. It's interesting to hear Foucault referred to. It's unfortunate, but it's interesting. Because Foucault, like his French intellectual confreres, essentially believed that the only basis upon which hierarchies were established is power. And that's part of this pernicious, politically correct doctrine that I've been speaking about. When a hierarchy becomes corrupt, then the only way to ascend it is to exercise power. That's essentially the definition of a tyranny. But that doesn't mean that the imperfect hierarchies that we have constructed in our relatively free countries, which at least tilt somewhat towards competence and ability, as evidenced by the staggering achievements of civilization that we've managed to produce, it doesn't mean that the appropriate way of diagnosing them is to assume without reservation unidimensionally that they're all about power, and as a consequence everyone who occupies any position within them is a tyrant or a tyrant in the making. And that is certainly the fundamental claim of someone like Foucault. And it's part and parcel of this, what would you call it, this ideological catastrophe that's political correctness. I'm not here to argue against progress. I'm not here to argue against equality of opportunity. Anyone with any sense understands that even if you're selfish, you're best served by allowing yourself access to the multiplicitous talents of everyone, and to discriminate against them for arbitrary reasons unrelated to their competences. It's abhorrent. That has nothing to do with the issue at hand. It isn't that good things haven't happened in the past and should continue to happen. That's not the point. The point is the point my compatriot Fry made, which is, well, we can agree on the catastrophe and we can agree on the historic inequity, but there's no way I'm going to agree that political correctness is the way to address any of that, and there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, some of which I would say was displayed quite clearly tonight.
Thank you both. We're just going to do a quick discussion with the online audience who's watching right now, just to get your reactions to the debate. And maybe just start with you, Jordan. There were some heated moments here. Did that surprise you, that the exchanges that you had with Michael Eric Dyson?
Well, I wouldn't say it surprised me. Well, I suppose it probably did. It just didn't seem like a very good tactical move, and I stand by what I said. I don't see any reason at all that my racial identity needed to be dragged into the discussion, independent of my personality proclivity. I would say what I just said to Mr. Fry here is that it was a pleasure sharing the stage with him. I've rarely heard anyone ever deliver their convictions with such a remarkable sense of passion and wit and forbearance and erudition. It was really something.
Yeah.